So in this lesson, we're going to talk about how genetic variation occurs and why meiosis is so important to increasing the genetic variation of our population. We know that all original sources of genetic diversity stem from mutations in an organism's DNA because these mutations end up creating different versions of genes, which we call alleles. So alleles are the different versions of our genes. And in sexual reproduction, we've seen that these alleles get shuffled around, especially during meiosis, and that's what causes genetic variation in the population. And when the genes vary, we know that ultimately the physical manifestation of those genes will also vary as well. The behavior of chromosomes during meiosis and the process of fertilization is primarily responsible for most of the variation that we see in each generation between parents and offspring. And there's three major mechanisms that contribute to this variation. So first, we have the independent assortment of chromosomes. Second is crossing over, and the third is random fertilization. And we'll talk about each of those individually. So with regards to the independent assortment of chromosomes, we know that homologous pairs of chromosomes orient themselves randomly at metaphase 1 of meiosis. And in independent assortment, each of these pairs of chromosomes sorts their maternal and paternal homologs into the daughter cells independently of the other pairs. So for example, just because one of your chromosomes is from the mom in metaphase on this side, it doesn't mean that the other ones in line have to also be from the mom. They assort independently, so they all kind of move, and as long as they're in the middle, the process will continue on. So this really dramatically increases the number of possibilities for how chromosomes can assort themselves into your gametes, and the actual number of combinations is 2 to the n, where n is the haploid chromosome number. So for humans, where n is 23, the number of possible chromosome combinations is around 8 million, and that's just for the number of chromosome combinations in the cell. So for example, we could have in this case, this organism has a set of 4 chromosomes, and we have both parents' chromosomes are oriented in line with each other, but it's also possible, like I said, that they might not assort themselves in that way, and they might independently assort, and just because blue is over here doesn't mean all the blues have to be over here. It could be blue here, red, blue, etc. And then you can see we've already got, with just these 4 chromosomes, after metaphase 2 and our daughter cells, we have a very original combination of the possibility for how our gametes could be created. And remember, meiosis is happening for all of your gametes, so just because you have this combination in one doesn't mean it's going to be the same in the other one. It might look like this, or even something else. Another contributor to genetic diversity in our populations is crossing over. So you've learned in meiosis that crossing over occurs during prophase 1, which essentially causes the homologous pairs to exchange DNA with each other. And this typically in humans occurs on average around 1 to 3 times per chromosome pair. And this produces what is known as recombinant chromosomes, which essentially are chromosomes that combine DNA inherited from both parents. So now, with crossing over, we have new combinations of maternal and paternal alleles that you might not have seen in the original parent cells. You could have totally new chromosome combinations. And so this also increases the genetic variation in the population. You can see here, we start out with all blue and all red, but after synapsis and crossing over, we end up getting a little bit of a different chromosome in these sister chromatids. And then, once those are separated, we see you get very different chromosomes than your original parents. And then each of these daughter cells is completely different from the other and also from the parents. They're all genetically unique because of these recombinant chromosomes. Finally, the third contributor to genetic variation is probably the simplest to understand, and this is called random fertilization. So this basically means that any sperm can fuse with any unfertilized egg, which is called an ovum, and there's no rhyme or reason dictating how these sperm and egg come together. Once we see the sperm and egg come together in humans, we know that each of those has a potential of one of 8.4 million possible chromosome combinations, which we know from independent assortment, and the two of those together produce a zygote with any one of about 7 trillion diploid combinations. So when people tell you you are unique and special, you really are. For the most part, you are 1 in 70 trillion, so you can feel good about yourself in that way. And how they get that number, that's your 2 to the 23rd power of the egg times the 2 to the 23rd power of the sperm, and that gets you around 7 trillion. With crossing over, we get even more variation, and your zygote has a unique genetic identity that is really, really special. So what does this mean for our populations? Once we get to the section on evolution, we're going to learn a lot more about natural selection. But essentially what natural selection is the kind of favoring of certain alleles over others because of the environment. So even though we get these random mutations, if we happen to get a mutation that is beneficial due to the conditions of the environment, that mutation will tend to be passed on over time, and that is how we see change in the population over time. But it's very important that we have this genetic variation, because without it, we wouldn't be able to adapt and evolve in response to our changing environment, and we might go extinct. So these three things, the independent assortment of chromosomes, crossing over, and random fertilization, are really beneficial to the survival of our population because they enable us to evolve after being acted on by natural selection. Asexual reproduction is very inexpensive in comparison to sexual reproduction. But sexual reproduction is nearly universal among animals, in particular because genetic variation is very advantageous. With asexual reproduction, pretty much your primary source of genetic variation is going to come from mutations in the DNA. That gives you a little bit more of an understanding of why genetic variation is so important and why it is crucial that meiosis occurs the way that it does.